She said my yard belonged to everyone. Then she started walking through it daily. I asked her to stop. She fined me for blocking community access. Months passed. Fear. Then I found the deed in my attic. Proved she never had the right. What I did next ended her reign forever. My name is Sarah Whitfield, and for 6 years my family lived at 214 Birchwood Lane in Willow Creek Estates, a quiet cul-de-sac neighborhood outside Charlotte. My husband Mark worked in construction. I taught 3rd grade, and our kids, Emma and Jake, rode bikes on sidewalks lined with dogwood trees. We bought that house because of the yard, half an acre of soft grass Mark and I built by hand, weekend by weekend, until it became the kind of lawn neighbors complimented on their evening walks. It was ours. Or so we believed before Karen Mosley became HOA president. Willow Creek had always been informal about its shared spaces. There was a worn dirt path along the side of our property that families used as a shortcut to the cul-de-sac park and the bus stop, a habit going back decades, tolerated quietly by every homeowner before us. Karen Mosley ran unopposed for HOA president the year we moved in, promising to restore order to the neighborhood. She arrived at every meeting with a laminated binder of bylaws, color-coded tabs, and a smile that never once reached her eyes. Neighbors called her thorough. I called her exhausting. At first her rule enforcement seemed almost comical. Citations for mailbox paint 2 shades off-white. Warnings about grass exceeding 4 inches. A strongly worded letter about our garden gnomes. Inappropriate expression. We laughed it off over dinner, assuming she'd eventually find a hobby that wasn't us. The shortcut path ran directly along our property's western edge. Technically inside our fence line according to the plat map Mark had reviewed before closing. Karen, however, insisted it was a community walking corridor, a phrase she used so often it started to sound like an incantation. I remember the first time she used it herself, cutting diagonally across our lawn in pristine white sneakers, clipboard in hand, waving at us through the kitchen window like she owned the place. Mark joked that she probably measured the grass length as she walked. It wasn't funny for long. By spring, Karen had convinced 3 other board members that the path was historically communal, citing an unnamed document she claimed existed in HOA archives. No one had actually seen this document. When Mark asked to review it, she said it was being digitized and would take time. Our neighbor Priya Anand, who'd lived on Birchwood longer than anyone, pulled me aside at the mailbox one afternoon. She remembered when the path was created, an informal dirt track worn by kids in the 80s, never legally designated, never surveyed, never anything but a neighborly courtesy nobody had to grant. Priya warned me gently that Karen had done something similar to the Hendersons 2 streets over, slowly expanding a shared drainage easement until it swallowed 1/3 of their backyard. The Hendersons eventually moved. Karen, Priya said, never let go of anything once she decided it was hers. I didn't want trouble, and a yard my kids could play in without a stranger cutting through with a clipboard. So I emailed Karen politely, asking if the community could route the shortcut along the sidewalk instead, which added barely 30 seconds to anyone's walk. Her reply came within the hour, formal and clipped, citing section 7.3 of bylaws that didn't exist in the copy Mark and I had signed. She wrote that long-standing communal usage patterns could not be unilaterally revoked by a single homeowner, and that my request would be brought before the board. I attended the next HOA meeting expecting a reasonable conversation. Instead, Karen presented my email to the room as evidence I was hostile to community cohesion. Several neighbors I barely knew nodded along, apparently primed beforehand. I left the meeting shaking, not from anger yet, but from confusion. Mark suggested we simply install a small decorative fence along the property line. Nothing aggressive, just enough to mark where our yard began. It seemed like the obvious solution. We had no idea that fence would become the single most contested 18 inches of vinyl in Willow Creek's history. The permit request sat with the HOA Architectural Committee for 6 weeks. Every other fence request that spring was approved within days. Ours kept returning with new objections: wrong color, wrong height, wrong aesthetic alignment with community character. Each rejection signed personally by Karen Mosley, board chair. During those 6 weeks, foot traffic across our lawn increased. Karen, apparently unofficially encouraging it, told neighbors at a barbecue that the path was still open for now, while the fence issue was under review, a phrasing that made it sound like our own yard was on parole. I started noticing patterns I hadn't before. Karen walking the path at odd hours, sometimes well after dark, sometimes with her phone raised as if recording something. Mark thought I was being paranoid. I wasn't sure myself. Our yard at 11 p.m. was real. Emma, our 8-year-old, asked one morning why the HOA lady kept walking so close to her swing set. I told her it was nothing, that grown-ups sometimes just like to walk. But watching my daughter hesitate before going outside to play planted something sharp and cold in my chest. Jake, only 5, once left a chalk drawing of our family on the driveway, colorful stick figures under a rainbow. The next morning it was gone, scrubbed clean, with a small yellow HOA notice taped to our door citing unauthorized sidewalk markings creating community liability. Karen had signed it herself. That was the moment something shifted in me. Not rage exactly, but resolve. This wasn't about grass height or paint colors anymore. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was testing how much of our life she could claim before we pushed back. And I intended to find out exactly why. I began keeping a folder. Every email, every citation, every photograph of her walking our property, time-stamped and organized the way I organized my classroom's grading rubrics. Mark thought I was overreacting. I told him that women who get called overreacting usually turn out to have been right all along. Priya mentioned something else at the mailbox that week, Karen's term as HOA president. According to the original bylaws Priya had kept from the neighborhood's founding, was supposed to be limited to 2 consecutive years. Karen was entering her 5th. No election had been held since the 2nd year. I filed that detail away too, not fully understanding its weight yet. At the time it felt like a technicality, the kind of paperwork oversight that happens in volunteer organizations. I had no idea it would become the loose thread that eventually unraveled everything Karen Mosley had built. By early June, the fence permit was denied a 3rd time. This citation claiming our proposed vinyl panels did not match community architectural standards, despite 4 identical fences already standing 2 streets away. I called the HOA office directly. The woman who answered sighed and said, "That's just how Karen is." That phrase, "that's just how Karen is," unsettled me more than any single incident had. It meant this wasn't new. It meant an entire community had quietly organized its behavior around one woman's moods, and nobody had the energy left to challenge it. I decided I would find that energy myself, so I called a lawyer, just to understand our rights. Her name was Diane Ruiz, and during our first call she asked one simple question that would define the next year of my life. Do you have the original deed and property survey? I said I'd check the attic.
The mâu thuẫn nhỏ bi găng.
Fittingly, on a Tuesday, I came home from school pickup to find Karen standing in the middle of our lawn with two other board members, measuring tape stretched across the grass, marking small orange flags every few feet like she was staking a claim on new territory. We're just documenting the corridor width, she said brightly when I asked what she was doing, as if orange flags planted in my daughter's play area were the most reasonable thing in the world. I asked her to leave distance in the official minutes. That evening, an HOA notice appeared in our mailbox citing obstruction of a documented community pathway, with a $150 fine attached. When I called for clarification, the office explained that Karen had officially logged the path into the HOA's shared use registry that very afternoon, backdated to the prior spring. Mark wanted to march straight to her house. I talked him out of it, worried an angry confrontation would only give Karen ammunition. Instead, I emailed the board requesting the documented pathway records referenced in our fine. No response came for 11 days. When it did, it raised more questions than answers. The document Karen finally produced was a single typed page, undated and signed, claiming the path had been established by community consensus sometime in the 1990s. There was no notarization, no board vote record, nothing beyond her own assertion typed onto HOA letterhead she had apparently designed herself. Diane, our lawyer, read it over and actually laughed. This wouldn't hold up in small claims court, let alone anything serious, she said. But that's not really the point for people like this. The point is exhaustion. She's betting you'll pay the fine just to make it stop. We didn't pay it. I requested the property survey from the county recorder's office, the same survey Diane had asked about weeks earlier. It took 3 business days to arrive, and when it did, Mark spread it across our kitchen table like a treasure map we'd been waiting our whole lives to read. The survey was unambiguous. Our property line extended a full 4 feet beyond where the community path supposedly ran. There was no easement recorded anywhere in the county database. No pathway, no corridor, no historical designation. Legally, every square inch Karen had been walking belonged entirely to us. I photographed the survey and mailed a certified copy to the HOA board along with a formal letter disputing the fine. Karen's response arrived faster than any prior correspondence. Terse and strange, she claimed the county survey was outdated and that HOA records superseded municipal documentation in community matters. That claim, Diane told me flatly, was legally false. HOA bylaws could regulate fence colors and lawn heights within a homeowner's own property, but they could never override county-recorded property lines. Karen either genuinely didn't understand property law, or she understood it perfectly and was counting on nobody checking. Around this time, our neighbor Gary Thompson, who'd always sided loudly with Karen at meetings, started acting strange around us, friendly in private, distant in public. I didn't think much of it then. I later learned Gary had his own history with Karen, one he wasn't ready to share yet. Meanwhile, The fines kept coming. A notice for excessive resistance to community integration. A notice for failure to maintain pathway sightlines after Mark trimmed a hedge to its normal height. Each fine smaller than the last. Individually almost laughable. Cumulatively designed to wear us down through sheer volume. I started attending every HOA meeting. Sitting in the front row with my folder. Taking notes visibly enough that Karen noticed. She began addressing questions to certain homeowners who enjoy documenting everything. Her tone dripping with a sarcasm the rest of the board seemed too tired to correct. One night after a meeting, an older resident named Frank stopped me in the parking lot. He'd lived in Willow Creek since it was built and remembered when the HOA presidency rotated every 2 years like the bylaws required. "Karen just never left," he said quietly. Nobody had the energy to ask why. Frank's comment echoed Priya's earlier warning about Karen's expired term. I asked Diane whether an improperly extended HOA presidency could affect the legitimacy of fines issued during that period. She said it could, potentially invalidating years of enforcement actions, but proving it required documentation we didn't yet have. So I requested Willow Creek's official meeting minutes going back 5 years. A right explicitly granted to homeowners under state HOA transparency law. The board delayed, citing administrative backlog. When the records finally arrived, 3 full years were conspicuously missing, including the year Karen's term should have ended. I asked the office manager, a soft-spoken woman named Deb, why those years were absent. She hesitated before admitting, almost apologetically, that Karen personally maintained the physical minutes archive at her house and had never returned certain boxes when the office moved locations 2 years earlier. That detail sat with me for days. An HOA president keeping the community's legal records inside her own home, selectively releasing whatever supported her position, felt less like disorganization and more like design. I began to suspect Karen wasn't simply overzealous. She was protecting something specific. The escalation continued in smaller, meaner ways. Emma's chalk drawings were repeatedly erased. A garden gnome Jake had named Sir Pebbles vanished from our flower bed one afternoon. Later spotted, according to Priya, sitting on Karen's own porch 3 houses down, wearing what looked suspiciously like a tiny HOA badge. When I mentioned Sir Pebbles at the next meeting, Karen denied all knowledge, though her mouth twitched in a way that told me exactly what I needed to know. Small pettiness, I realized, was its own kind of confession. People who feel powerful rarely bother hiding their satisfaction. Then came the first real twist. A neighbor I barely knew, an older woman named Ruth from the far end of the cul-de-sac, approached me quietly at the grocery store. She said she'd overheard Karen on the phone once, laughing about finally getting the Whitfield lot for something called the Greenway project. I had no idea what the Greenway project was. Ruth didn't either. Only that Karen mentioned it excitedly, like it mattered more than any pathway dispute ever could. I wrote it down in my folder under a new tab labeled simply, Motive. Something bigger than a shortcut was happening here. Diane suggested requesting Willow Creek's HOA financial disclosures, standard practice available to any homeowner in good standing. The request triggered an unusually fast, unusually defensive response from Karen personally, insisting financial records were confidential board matters, not subject to individual homeowner review. A claim state law directly contradicted. By the end of that stretch, I no longer felt like a homeowner defending her lawn. I felt like someone slowly uncovering a much larger story. One where the shortcut across our grass was never really about convenience at all. It was the visible edge of something Karen badly needed hidden. Leo Tang Lop MOT began the week, Karen announced. Without any board vote I could find record of. That Willow Creek would be formalizing pedestrian infrastructure through select properties. Our lot listed first among 4 others slated for what she now openly called the Community Greenway Corridor. The proposal, mailed to every household except conveniently omitting mention of which specific yards were affected, described a paved walking path connecting the cul-de-sac park to a planned amenity center. Reading between the vague language, it was obvious our western property line sat directly in its path. I called an emergency meeting with Diane. She explained that an HOA could theoretically propose shared infrastructure improvements, but converting private property into public pathway required either homeowner consent or a formal legal easement process, neither of which Karen had initiated through any recognized municipal or legal channel. She's trying to build public consensus before she has legal standing, Diane said, tapping the proposal packet. If enough neighbors believe it's already decided, they stop questioning whether it should be. It was, I realized, the exact same tactic she'd used with the original historic pathway claim. At the community forum announcing the Greenway, Karen presented renderings of a charming brick path lined with benches and lampposts, entirely superimposed over an aerial photo of our actual backyard. Several neighbors applauded. Nobody seemed to notice or care that the beautiful rendering erased our home's swing set entirely. I stood up during the Q&A and asked, as calmly as my shaking hands allowed, whether the Greenway plan had been surveyed, permitted, or legally approved by the county. Karen's smile flickered for half a second before she said the project was in the visioning phase, which meant, functionally, no. After the meeting, 3 separate neighbors approached me privately, apologizing quietly for the applause, admitting they'd assumed the plan was already finalized because Karen presented it that way. It was the first time I understood how effectively her confidence alone functioned as evidence for people too busy to check. That week, someone we never definitively confirmed who damaged our irrigation system. 3 sprinkler heads snapped clean off along exactly the strip of lawn marked in Karen's Greenway rendering. The HOA's incident report, filed by Karen herself, described it as pre-existing where consistent with the pathway's historic foot traffic. Mark, usually the calmer of us, lost his temper reading that report aloud. Historic foot traffic on infrastructure that doesn't exist yet, he said, laughing bitterly. We filed a police report for the vandalism, though without camera footage. The responding officer admitted there was little they could formally pursue. That was the moment we decided to install security cameras, both for evidence and for our own peace of mind. Mark chose angles covering the entire western property line, the swing set, and the driveway. Within 2 weeks, those cameras would capture something none of us expected. Karen escalated her public messaging, sending a community-wide newsletter praising residents who prioritize collective progress over personal territorialism, language unmistakably aimed at us though never naming us directly. Several neighbors we'd considered friends grew noticeably colder at the mailbox, greetings shortening into silent nods. Priya, still quietly on our side, told me Karen had personally visited several households, framing our fence request and pathway objections as selfish obstruction of children's safe walking routes. a claim that ignored the existing sidewalk running parallel to our property the entire time. I began documenting every neighbor interaction too. Not out of paranoia but necessity, because Diane warned that HOA disputes often devolved into competing narratives where whoever documented more thoroughly usually prevailed, regardless of who was actually telling the truth. I intended to be the one telling the truth and proving it. The camera footage from our second week caught something unmistakable. Karen, at 11:40 p.m., walking the disputed strip alone with a flashlight, pausing at our fence line, then deliberately stepping several feet onto our actual lawn, well past any reasonable interpretation of a public pathway, before continuing on. She did this 4 more times over the following 2 weeks. Always after dark. Always alone. Sometimes photographing something on our property with her phone. We had no idea yet what she was documenting, but the pattern was unmistakably deliberate, not the casual habit of a well-meaning neighbor. Diane reviewed the footage carefully. "This actually helps us more than it hurts you," she said. "She's establishing a pattern of trespass, not usage by the broader community. That distinction matters enormously if this ever reaches a courtroom. I hadn't considered we might actually end up there." Meanwhile, the fines continued in stranger forms. A citation for unauthorized landscaping alteration, after Mark replaced a dying rosebush. A citation for excessive privacy measures, after we added a simple lattice screen near our patio. Each fine smaller and stranger than the last. Each one signed personally by Karen. I started calculating the total. Across 4 months, Karen's fines against our household alone totaled just over $2,300, dwarfing every other homeowner citations combined that entire year, according to records Deb quietly slipped me during a private conversation at the HOA office. Her voice barely above a whisper. Deb, turned out, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Karen's behavior long before we arrived, watching families cycle through the neighborhood exhausted and defeated. She couldn't openly help us, fearing for her own job, but small gestures, an extra document here, a quiet warning there, became invaluable over time. Through Deb, I learned Karen had unilaterally approved the Greenway visioning budget, using HOA reserve funds, nearly $40,000, without a documented board vote matching quorum requirements. It was the first concrete financial irregularity I'd found, though I still didn't understand its full significance. Diane suggested I formally request an independent financial audit, a right available to homeowners when reasonable suspicion of mismanagement existed. Karen's response to the request, when it finally came weeks later, was unusually aggressive, threatening legal consequences for defamatory financial accusations against a volunteer board member. That threat, ironically, told me more than any document could have. People confident in their innocence rarely respond to a routine audit request with legal threats.
I saved her email.
Forwarded it to Diane immediately, and felt, for the first time, something shift from fear into quiet, focused determination. The neighborhood, meanwhile, was fracturing visibly along invisible lines. Some families avoided us entirely, having absorbed Karen's narrative wholesale. Others, like Priya and increasingly Ruth, began sharing small pieces of information whenever they could, forming an informal network of neighbors who'd each had their own quiet run-ins with Karen. Gary Thompson finally approached me directly one evening, visibly nervous, asking if we could talk somewhere private. He revealed that 3 years earlier, Karen had used a nearly identical playbook against his family regarding a shared driveway, fining them relentlessly until they simply gave up and granted access. Gary admitted, with obvious shame, that he'd sided publicly with Karen ever since, terrified of becoming her next target if he didn't. "I should have fought back then," he said. "Watching you do it now is the first time I've felt like maybe it's not too late for any of us." That conversation changed something in the neighborhood's quiet undercurrent. Gary began sharing his own old documentation, fines, and emails from 3 years prior, a pattern eerily identical to ours, suggesting this wasn't Karen's first attempt to expand her territory through manufactured pathway claims and selective enforcement. Diane compiled everything into a growing case file: Gary's old fines, our camera footage, the missing meeting minutes, the unauthorized budget approval, the false historic pathway document. Individually, each piece seemed survivable for Karen. Together, they formed a pattern no reasonable board or court could easily dismiss. Karen, seemingly sensing the shifting mood, changed tactics again, this time appealing directly to our children's safety, claiming at a public meeting that our unfenced, unofficial boundary created hazards for kids walking to the bus stop, conveniently ignoring that the county-maintained sidewalk sat entirely outside our property. Several parents, worried and unaware of the actual survey data, began pressuring us informally to just let the kids through, framing our legal property rights as selfishness. I found myself apologizing at the grocery store for owning my own backyard, a surreal experience Diane assured me was, unfortunately, common in HOA conflicts. That week, I finally received copies of the original 1994 subdivision plat from the county archive, definitively confirming the pathway had never been designated, dedicated, or platted as any form of public or shared access, undermining Karen's central claim entirely from its earliest possible foundation. I made copies of the plat map and mailed them, alongside the county survey, to every household in Willow Creek, accompanied by a calm, factual letter explaining the actual legal boundaries and inviting neighbors to review the public records themselves rather than take anyone's word, including mine. Karen's response was immediate and furious. An emergency HOA notice accusing me of unauthorized mass communication undermining board authority, followed by a proposed fine of $500 for distributing misleading community materials, despite every document I'd sent being sourced directly and verifiably from public county records. That fine, more than any before it, felt different, not petty anymore, but desperate. Diane agreed. "Pathway anymore," she said. "She's defending whatever this Greenway project actually is for her personally, and she's running out of ways to do it quietly." I refused to pay, formally disputing the fine in writing and requesting it be placed on the agenda for open board discussion, a right explicitly protected under our state's HOA transparency statutes. Statutes Karen had clearly never expected an ordinary homeowner to actually understand and invoke. The board meeting where my dispute was scheduled filled unusually full that month, word having spread quietly through Priya, Ruth, and Gary's growing network of neighbors who'd started comparing notes, some for the first time realizing their own past conflicts with Karen followed the exact same pattern. I walked into that meeting with Diane's case file organized into color-coded tabs of my own now, feeling something I hadn't felt in months, not fear, not exhaustion, but readiness. Whatever Karen had built her power on, I finally had enough evidence to start pulling at its foundation. The meeting itself, surprisingly, produced a brief calm. Facing a fuller room than usual, Karen pivoted smoothly, publicly withdrawing my $500 fine as a gesture of community goodwill, framing herself as gracious rather than caught, a performance so practiced it almost impressed me despite everything. For a few weeks afterward, things genuinely quieted. No new fines arrived. Karen stopped walking our lawn, at least during visible daylight hours. Mark started cautiously hoping the worst was over. I wanted to believe it too, though something about the sudden stillness felt less like peace than preparation. Priya warned me not to relax too quickly. "She's regrouping," she said flatly over coffee one morning. "I've seen this before with the Hendersons. The quiet part is always right before she tries something bigger." I trusted Priya's instincts more than my own hopeful exhaustion, and kept documenting everything anyway. During the lull, I focused energy on Diane's audit request, still unresolved, and on tracking down whatever the mysterious Greenway project actually was. County planning records showed no application, no permit, no proposal filed under Willow Creek's name for any pedestrian infrastructure project of that description. That absence was its own answer. Whatever Karen called visioning phase publicly existed nowhere officially, meaning the $40,000 in reserve funds she'd allocated toward it had gone somewhere else entirely, a discrepancy Diane flagged as potentially serious enough to warrant involving the state's HOA regulatory division. Emma's chalk drawings reappeared on our driveway unbothered for the first time in months. Jake asked hopefully if the HOA lady had moved away. I told him I wasn't sure, but that we were going to make sure our yard stayed ours no matter what happened next. Gary continued quietly gathering support, discovering through casual conversations that at least 6 other households across Willow Creek's history had experienced strikingly similar pathway or easement disputes with Karen, most resolving in the homeowner simply capitulating rather than facing prolonged financial and social pressure. Ruth mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Karen's son had recently graduated from a landscape architecture program and had started his own small design firm nearby. I noted it in my folder without fully understanding its relevance yet, though Diane's eyes narrowed with sudden interest when I mentioned it to her. A quick, entirely legal search of public business registries revealed Karen's son's firm had been incorporated 8 months earlier. Its stated specialty listed plainly as Community Pathway and Greenway Design Consulting. The pieces, suddenly, began arranging themselves into a shape far uglier than mere control or pride. Diane laid it out carefully. If Karen intended to push the Greenway project through using HOA reserve funds, and her son's firm was positioned to receive the design and construction contract, this wasn't simply overreach anymore. It was, potentially, a straightforward conflict of interest fraud scheme. I sat with that possibility for days, feeling something more complicated than anger settle over the whole ordeal. This was never really about a shortcut, or grass, or even control for its own sake. It was about money, quietly funneled through fear and fines dressed up as community values. Mark wanted to confront Karen directly with what we suspected. Diane firmly advised against it. "The moment she knows what you actually have," she said, "she'll start destroying evidence, if she hasn't already. Everything now depends on documentation, patience, and choosing the right moment to act." So we waited, gathering quietly instead of confronting loudly. I requested Karen's son's business filings, cross-referenced them against the HOA's leaked budget allocation Deb had shared, and began building a timeline showing exactly when the Greenway visioning, spending aligned with his firm's incorporation date. The calm held just long enough for us to build something real. Diane compared it, only half joking, to reinforcing a dam before the Real flood arrived. Neither of us knew yet just how close that flood already was, or how violently Karen would react once she felt the water rising. Then, on a Thursday evening in late July, everything changed at once. Karen announced an emergency board vote scheduled for the following week to expedite Greenway infrastructure approval, and simultaneously, a survey crew appeared unannounced at the edge of our property, measuring stakes already driven into our lawn. Leo Tang Lop Hai opened with those survey stakes, 5 of them, planted in a neat diagonal line straight through Emma's swing set area, orange ribbons fluttering like small flags of an occupation none of us had agreed to. Mark pulled them up immediately. New ones appeared the next morning. I called the surveying company listed on the small equipment tags left behind. The dispatcher confirmed they'd been hired by a private client for a residential Greenway feasibility assessment, unable to disclose further details without written client consent, though she did confirm the client's last name matched Karen's son's firm. Diane filed an immediate formal objection with the HOA board, demanding the emergency vote be postponed pending resolution of the unresolved financial audit and the still unanswered dispute over the pathway's legal legitimacy. Karen denied the postponement request within an hour, citing time-sensitive infrastructure funding opportunities. That phrase, time-sensitive funding opportunities, felt like confirmation of everything we suspected. Something external was pressuring Karen's timeline, and Diane guessed it might be a grant or municipal incentive requiring proof of community buy-in before a certain deadline, explaining the sudden desperate urgency behind her actions. I spent that week attending every neighbor's doorstep I could reach, calmly sharing the county plat maps, the survey, and a careful, factual summary of the financial questions surrounding the Greenway project, deliberately avoiding accusation, simply inviting people to ask their own questions before the vote. Some doors closed quickly, residents unwilling to involve themselves, but more open than I expected, especially among newer families who'd never fully trusted Karen's confident certainty in the first place. Having only complied out of the same exhaustion Priya had warned me eventually claimed almost everyone. Karen, sensing the shifting ground beneath her, escalated dramatically. A city-wide local news blog, apparently tipped off by someone inside the HOA, ran a small feature praising Willow Creek's innovative community Greenway initiative, featuring an interview with Karen and, notably, glowing quotes from her son's landscape firm. The article never disclosed the family relationship. When I contacted the reporter directly, sharing the business registry documents, she seemed genuinely startled, admitting she'd taken Karen's presentation at face value without independently verifying the firm's ownership, a mistake she quietly promised to correct in a follow-up piece. That follow-up piece, published 4 days later, was measured but unmistakably different in tone, raising direct questions about the undisclosed family connection and the unusual absence of any county planning application for a project already receiving HOA reserve funding. Karen's public composure, for the first time, visibly cracked. At the following board meeting, packed tighter than any in Willow Creek's recent memory, Karen accused unnamed, disgruntled homeowners of orchestrating a smear campaign against community progress. She never looked directly at me, though everyone in the room understood exactly who she meant. I stood again, this time with copies of the business registry, the leaked budget document, and a simple timeline chart Diane had helped design, showing the alignment between her son's incorporation date and the Greenway fund allocation. I didn't accuse her of anything. I simply asked the board to review the facts. The room went uncomfortably silent. Two board members, visibly uneasy, requested the emergency vote be tabled pending independent review. The first time in years anyone on that board had publicly contradicted Karen in an open meeting. Her jaw tightened, but she agreed, framing it as welcoming transparency. That small victory felt enormous, though Diane cautioned it wasn't over. Cornered people don't stop fighting, she reminded me on the drive home. They just change how they fight. Within days, her warning proved painfully accurate, in ways none of us had anticipated. Our home's Wi-Fi began cutting out randomly, always around the same evening hours, always resolving itself within minutes. Mark, suspicious, checked our outdoor equipment box and found the shared utility line, which technically ran along the same disputed property strip, had been tampered with, a wire deliberately loosened. We couldn't prove who'd done it, though the timing, days after the contentious meeting, felt impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Diane advised documenting it anyway, photographing the tampered box, filing a police report for the record, building the pattern even when direct proof remained frustratingly out of reach. Then came a call from my school principal, gently mentioning an anonymous complaint alleging I'd been using school resources to conduct a personal harassment campaign against a community volunteer, a baseless accusation that took a full afternoon of uncomfortable explanation to fully clear from my professional record. I never proved Karen made that call, but the timing, again, spoke loudly enough on its own. Diane began referring to this pattern clinically as collateral pressure, a tactic aimed not at winning the actual dispute, but at making the cost of continuing it personally unbearable for me specifically. Emma came home from school upset one afternoon, saying a classmate's mother had told her, in front of other children, that her family was trying to steal the neighborhood's park. I held my daughter while she cried, furious in a way I hadn't allowed myself to feel until that exact moment. That night, Mark and I agreed on something important. Whatever happened next, we would shield the kids from the adult ugliness of it entirely, keeping every conversation, every document, every stressful phone call carefully out of earshot, protecting the one part of this fight that mattered more than winning. Priya, meanwhile, uncovered something significant through a cousin who worked at the county planning office. A preliminary Greenway grant application had indeed been filed, not by Willow Creek's HOA, but privately, by Karen's son's firm, listing the Whitfield property as an already secured pathway easement. That word, secured, stopped me cold. Our property had been listed on an official grant application as though the dispute were already resolved in Karen's favor. Months before any legal easement existed, before any board vote, before we'd agreed to anything whatsoever regarding our own land. Diane called it audacious even by HOA dispute standards, explaining that submitting false property status information on a municipal grant application could constitute actual fraud, not merely an HOA bylaw violation, elevating the entire situation into territory involving potential criminal liability rather than simple civil disagreement. We requested a formal copy of the grant application through public records law. It arrived 3 weeks later, confirming everything Priya's cousin had described, complete with a fabricated letter of easement consent, bearing a signature that was unmistakably not mine, not Mark's, not anyone in our household. Diane immediately flagged the forged signature as the single most serious piece of evidence we'd found yet. Forgery on an official government document application wasn't a bylaw dispute anymore. It was a criminal matter, one she recommended reporting directly to both county authorities and, separately, to the state HOA regulatory board. I sat at our kitchen table that night staring at the forged signature, a rough approximation of my handwriting close enough to fool a stranger, close enough that someone had clearly studied a genuine sample of my writing beforehand. The thought of Karen doing that felt more unsettling than any fine ever had. Gary, when I showed him the forged document, went pale and quiet for a long moment before admitting something he'd never shared before. Karen had asked to borrow a signed HOA form from his old dispute years earlier, claiming she needed it for archival purposes, a request he'd thought nothing of at the time. That detail, small as it seemed, suggested this wasn't Karen's first forged signature, only the first one we'd caught. Diane began compiling a broader pattern, contacting the Hendersons, now living 2 states away, who confirmed with visible relief that yes, they too remembered a similarly convenient archival signature request. With 3 families now potentially connected to a pattern of forged documentation, Diane recommended we finally involve law enforcement formally, filing a detailed report with the county's economic crimes unit alongside our existing civil complaints, ensuring the criminal and community governance sides of this fight moved forward simultaneously. The detective assigned to our case, a measured, unhurried man named Officer Reyes, reviewed our file for nearly 2 hours before saying quietly, "This is more organized than most cases like this. You've done half our job for us already." It was the first time an outside authority had validated everything. Karen, unaware yet that law enforcement was involved, pressed forward publicly with the rescheduled emergency vote, seemingly confident the postponement had merely delayed rather than derailed her plans. She scheduled it for the same week Officer Reyes began his own quiet, parallel investigation into the forged easement document. I attended that rescheduled meeting with a strange, steady calm I hadn't expected to feel. Whatever happened in that room, something larger and more consequential was already moving forward outside it. Something Karen's confident smile and laminated binder couldn't find, dismiss, or talk her way around this time. The vote itself proceeded tensely, several board members visibly torn between institutional loyalty to Karen and the growing unease rippling through the room. When the final tally came back split, 3 in favor, 3 opposed, Karen used her tie-breaking presidential vote to push the Greenway project forward regardless. That moment, watching her use disputed authority to override a divided board on a project increasingly tangled in fraud and forgery, crystallized something for me completely. This wasn't about community consensus anymore, if it ever truly had been. It was about one woman refusing to release power she likely never legitimately held. Because buried in Diane's earlier research sat that quieter, patient thread from months before Karen's HOA presidency term. According to Willow Creek's original founding bylaws, had technically expired 3 years earlier, with no properly documented re-election ever conducted, meaning her tie-breaking vote may have carried no legal authority whatsoever. Diane requested Willow Creek's original 1993 governing documents from the county archive, comparing them meticulously against Karen's claimed authority. The bylaws were unambiguous: 2-year terms, mandatory community elections, term limits of 2 consecutive cycles. Karen had violated every single provision, unopposed, for years, simply by nobody checking. If we can prove her presidency itself is legally void, Diane explained carefully, then every fine, every vote, every unilateral decision she's made during that period potentially becomes challengeable. Not just the Greenway project, but years of enforcement actions against dozens of families across this entire neighborhood. That possibility felt almost too large to fully comprehend at first. This had started as a dispute over a shortcut across our lawn. It was quietly becoming something capable of unraveling years of quiet authoritarian control an entire neighborhood had simply absorbed as normal, never questioning whether it was even legal. We began carefully building what Diane called the standing challenge, a formal legal filing to invalidate Karen's continued presidency based on the expired term,
timed deliberately to coincide with whatever came next from Officer Reyes's forgery investigation, maximizing pressure from both legal fronts simultaneously.
Karen, still unaware of either investigation, doubled down publicly instead, sending a defiant community newsletter announcing the Greenway project's official approval, and framing continued opposition as toxic negativity holding back Willow Creek's progress. Language growing increasingly detached from the reality closing in around her. Priya's network of quietly gathered neighbors had grown substantial by then. Nearly a dozen households now sharing information, comparing old finds, old citations, old uncomfortable interactions. Each family realizing individually they'd absorbed years of unfair treatment they'd assumed was simply theirs alone to bear. One evening, an unfamiliar car parked outside our house for nearly 20 minutes, its driver seemingly watching before slowly pulling away. Our cameras caught the license plate. Officer Reyes, when I mentioned it, ran the plate quietly and confirmed it was registered to Karen's son. That discovery unsettled me more deeply than any fine or forged document had. This wasn't abstract anymore. A paperwork dispute resolved through lawyers and county records. Someone connected to Karen was physically watching our home, and I no longer felt certain where the boundaries of this conflict actually ended. Mark installed additional cameras that weekend, covering the driveway and street more thoroughly, while Diane formally notified both the HOA board and Officer Reyes about the surveillance, requesting it be documented as part of the broader pattern of intimidation surrounding the forged easement investigation. Officer Reyes, reviewing the footage, confirmed it matched a pattern he'd begun noticing in Karen's son's business dealings more broadly: aggressive tactics toward property. Owners standing between his firm and potential contracts. Tactics that, combined with his mother's HOA authority, formed a troublingly coordinated family operation. The state HOA regulatory board, meanwhile, had received Diane's formal complaint regarding the missing meeting minutes, the unauthorized budget allocation, and the improperly extended presidential term, opening its own administrative review. A slower process than criminal investigation, but one carrying serious potential consequences for Karen's entire board. I felt, for the first time in nearly a year, Something like the ground beginning to shift genuinely beneath Karen's feet rather than mine. 3 separate investigations now moved quietly forward simultaneously: criminal forgery, HOA regulatory misconduct, and our own civil property dispute, each one closing a different exit. Karen, perhaps sensing this shift instinctively even without confirmation, grew visibly more erratic at the next informal community gathering, snapping at a neighbor's simple question about the Greenway timeline, a sharpness entirely unlike her usually controlled public persona, cracks widening beneath the polished surface. Ruth mentioned overhearing Karen on the phone again, this time sounding genuinely frightened rather than confidently dismissive, discussing something about moving the paperwork before anyone digs further. A fragment that, combined with everything else, suggested Karen understood on some level how precarious her position had become. Diane advised patience once more, cautioning against tipping our hand before both the criminal and regulatory investigations reached sufficient maturity. Everything you've built only works if she doesn't get the chance to destroy evidence or resign quietly before facing real accountability, she reminded me firmly. That patience proved difficult. Watching Karen continue walking freely through the neighborhood, continuing informal Greenway preparation activities despite everything mounting against her, tested every ounce of restraint I had left. But I trusted Diane's judgment, and I trusted, finally, the process moving forward outside our control. Gary, emboldened by the growing coalition of neighbors, formally requested his own copy of Willow Creek's governing bylaws be redistributed community-wide, ensuring every household understood the legitimate 2-year term limits Karen had quietly ignored for years. A simple act of transparency Karen couldn't easily block without raising further suspicion. That redistribution, mailed to every home in the neighborhood, sparked exactly the kind of quiet, widespread questioning Diane had hoped for, neighbors comparing dates, realizing collectively how long Karen's authority had actually extended beyond what the community's own founding rules ever permitted her to hold. Karen's response, a defensive newsletter insisting continuity of leadership, had been informally endorsed by the community for years, only deepened suspicion rather than easing it. Her own words inadvertently confirming she'd never held a properly documented election in all that time. By the close of that stretch, Willow Creek felt like a neighborhood holding its breath. 3 quiet investigations converging beneath the surface of everyday suburban life, while Karen, increasingly isolated and increasingly desperate, prepared to make the kind of mistake only truly cornered people ever make. Leo Tanglop BA arrived without warning on a warm Saturday morning, while our family was away at Jake's soccer tournament 2 towns over. We returned home just after noon to find our decorative fence, the one finally approved months earlier after endless delays, completely torn out and discarded in our own driveway. The vinyl panels lay shattered across the grass. Posts snapped at their base, clearly removed with deliberate force rather than any accident. Our cameras, still recording despite everything, had captured the entire event. A landscaping crew, 3 men, working methodically under direct supervision from someone standing just off camera. When Mark enhanced the footage, the supervising figure's silhouette matched Karen's build and posture unmistakably, though her face remained frustratingly obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Still, the truck used by the crew displayed a small, familiar logo, her son's landscape firm, the same one from the grant application. Officer Reyes arrived within the hour, treating the incident as criminal property destruction rather than a simple HOA dispute, photographing the wreckage, collecting the footage, and formally adding it to the growing forgery investigation file already building steadily against both Karen and her son's business. That night, sitting amid the wreckage of a fence we'd fought over for nearly a year, I felt something break open in me that had nothing to do with fear anymore. Karen hadn't just crossed a legal line. She'd crossed into our physical absence, our children's safety, our sense of home itself. Diane, reviewing the footage the next morning, called it the mistake we've been waiting for, explaining that property destruction captured on clear video, tied directly to a business with documented financial motive, transformed our case from a slow-building pattern into something prosecutors could move on almost immediately. Karen, apparently unaware the cameras had captured everything so clearly, sent an HOA notice 2 days later citing us for hazardous debris accumulation, referring to the very fence pieces her own crew had destroyed, an act of audacity that made even Diane pause in genuine disbelief. That notice became, ironically, one of our strongest pieces of evidence, a written, time-stamped, officially signed document from Karen herself acknowledging the fence's destroyed condition just 2 days after her crew tore it down, a self-incriminating paper trail she'd created entirely without realizing it. Priya's growing coalition of neighbors, hearing about the fence, reacted with genuine shock rather than their previous cautious neutrality. This was no longer an abstract pathway dispute or confusing paperwork disagreement. Someone had entered our property and destroyed it while we weren't home, and everyone understood exactly what that meant. Gary organized an informal neighborhood meeting at his own house, deliberately outside Karen's HOA structure, inviting anyone who'd experienced similar treatment to share their stories openly. Nearly 20 households attended, filling his living room with a decade's worth of quiet grievances nobody had ever compared aloud before. Stories poured out that evening. Fines that mysteriously vanished after private favors. Pathway disputes eerily similar to ours. At least 2 other instances of damaged property following disagreements with Karen. Individually, each family had assumed their experience was isolated. Together, the pattern was undeniable and deeply disturbing. Officer Reyes attended part of that meeting at Diane's invitation, taking careful notes, later telling me privately it was the most comprehensive pattern of coordinated intimidation he'd encountered in a residential HOA case, comparing it seriously to organized extortion schemes he'd investigated in his earlier career. Karen, seemingly aware finally that something significant was shifting beneath her, grew increasingly reckless. She began appearing near our property at odd hours again, this time without even attempting to hide her presence, standing openly at the property line as though daring us to confront her directly. One evening, she knocked on our door herself, something she'd never done before, her composed public mask entirely absent. She accused us of destroying her reputation and turning the neighborhood against her, her voice cracking with a desperation that felt, for the first time, genuinely human rather than calculated. I didn't let her inside, but I didn't slam the door either. I told her, calmly, that we had never lied about anything, only shared documented facts, and that whatever reputation she felt was crumbling had been built entirely on her own choices, not ours. She left without responding. That confrontation, captured partially on our doorbell camera, later became relevant in an unexpected way. Karen's own words on that recording, admitting awareness of what's coming and referencing protecting my son's business, inadvertently confirmed the financial motive Diane and Officer Reyes had been carefully building toward proving. Days later, the state HOA regulatory board formally notified Willow Creek that Karen's continued presidency violated documented term limits, requiring an emergency community election within 30 days. A ruling that arrived publicly, impossible for Karen to quietly suppress or delay any further. Karen's response was immediate and telling. She resigned from the HOA presidency the following morning, framing it publicly as stepping back to focus on family, while privately, according to Deb, frantically requesting access to remove additional physical records from the HOA office before anyone else could review them. Diane, anticipating exactly this move, had already filed an emergency preservation order with the county, legally requiring all HOA records, including those Karen still personally held at her home, to remain untouched pending both the regulatory investigation and the ongoing criminal forgery case moving through the county prosecutor's office. That order arrived just in time. Officer Reyes later confirmed Karen had attempted to schedule a residential document shredding service for that same week, an appointment quietly canceled once she learned, through channels we never fully identified, that her home records now fell under formal legal preservation. Resignation, we quickly learned, did not equal accountability. Karen remained on the board temporarily as a transitional advisor, a role she'd apparently created herself without any documented authorization, continuing to exert quiet influence over remaining board members still nervous about fully breaking from her years of established control. Gary, along with Priya and 8 other coalition households, formally petitioned for Karen's complete removal from any board involvement, citing the mounting forgery investigation, the term limit violation, the fence destruction incident, and the newly revealed pattern of intimidation affecting multiple families across the neighborhood's history. The petition succeeded, barely, in a contentious special session where remaining board members, finally freed from years of Karen's dominating presence, voted to strip her of all remaining HOA involvement pending the outcome of both external investigations, a decision met with visible, exhausted relief across the room. Karen, stripped of official authority for the first time in years, grew even more unpredictable rather than less. She began an aggressive personal social media campaign, posting long, emotional statements accusing unnamed vindictive neighbors of a coordinated conspiracy to destroy her family's reputation and livelihood entirely. These posts, screenshotted carefully by nearly a dozen coalition members, ironically provided additional evidence of her state of mind and her continued fixation on the situation. Evidence Diane noted could prove useful in demonstrating pattern and intent during any eventual civil or criminal proceedings against her. Her son's landscape firm, meanwhile, quietly lost the Greenway grant application after county officials, alerted to the forgery allegations, launched their own independent review, discovering the fabricated easement signature and immediately revoking the firm's eligibility for the funding entirely, along with several other pending municipal contracts. That financial collapse hit harder than any fine or legal notice ever had. According to Ruth, who still occasionally spoke with a mutual acquaintance, Karen's household finances had apparently depended heavily on her son's anticipated municipal contracts now permanently closed off due entirely to their own fraudulent shortcuts. I felt, watching this unfold from a careful distance, An unexpected complexity in my own emotions. Satisfaction, certainly, but also a strange, unwanted sliver of pity for a family clearly unraveling under consequences they had, undeniably, brought entirely upon themselves through choices nobody had forced them to make. Mark reminded me gently that pity didn't require forgetting, and that protecting our own family had never been about destroying Karen's, only about refusing to let her destroy ours first. That distinction mattered to me, grounding the entire ordeal back into something clearer than simple vengeance. The criminal forgery case against Karen formally advanced that week. The county prosecutor's office filing charges related to the fabricated easement document and its use on the fraudulent grant application. Charges Officer Reyes confirmed carried potential penalties including fines and possible jail time upon conviction. Karen, through a lawyer of her own now, issued a brief public statement denying all wrongdoing, describing the charges as a gross misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion by hostile neighbors, language that rang increasingly hollow against the mounting, carefully documented evidence Diane and Officer Reyes had assembled. Our fence, meanwhile, remained a pile of broken vinyl in our own driveway for weeks, a strange, tangible reminder standing amid an otherwise increasingly abstract legal battle unfolding through documents, hearings, and quiet phone calls we mostly experienced secondhand through Diane's careful updates. Diane finally advised it was time to rebuild, not just symbolically but strategically, a properly surveyed, permitted, legally unambiguous fence along our actual property line, reinforced with metal posts sunk in concrete, accompanied by a formal notice recorded with the county establishing our boundary beyond any future dispute. We hired a contractor Priya recommended, someone who'd built fences for 2 other Karen-affected families already, understanding intuitively the importance of precision this time. Every measurement was double-checked against the county survey. Every post was placed with a permanence meant to outlast any future challenge entirely. Karen, apparently unable to resist one final act of defiance, called the County Code Enforcement Office directly, attempting to halt our fence construction, citing unresolved community pathway status, unaware or unwilling to accept that her own HOA presidency no longer carried any authority to make such claims. The code enforcement officer who arrived reviewed our permits, our survey, and the county's own confirmation that no pedestrian easement had ever legally existed, approving our construction on the spot and noting, almost sympathetically, that this was one of the cleanest property line disputes she'd ever personally reviewed. That approval felt like something larger than bureaucratic paperwork. Felt like an outside, neutral authority finally, formally, unambiguously confirming what we'd known all along. The lawn had always been ours. Every fine had been baseless. And every fear Karen had built her power on had never held any real foundation. The new fence went up over 3 days. Sturdy vinyl panels standing exactly where our old ones once had, this time backed by concrete footings and legal documentation strong enough that no future HOA president, however determined, could ever again claim the ground beneath our children's swing set as anything but ours. Emma helped paint a small welcome sign for the new gate, cheerful and defiant in equal measure. Jake asked, watching the final post go in, whether the HOA lady could ever come back now. I told him honestly that some fights end not because someone gives up, but because the truth finally wins. Karen's public defiance, meanwhile, began collapsing under its own accumulated weight. 2 additional families from the coalition came forward with their own forged signature evidence, expanding the criminal case significantly, while the state regulatory board's investigation into her extended, unauthorized presidency reached its own damning conclusion that same week. The regulatory board's final report, released publicly per state transparency requirements, confirmed Karen had operated without legitimate authority for over 3 years, invalidating a broad range of her enforcement actions and recommending the HOA formally review and potentially refund fines issued during that entire illegitimate period. That recommendation alone affected dozens of Willow Creek families beyond just us, transforming what had started as one woman's fight over her own backyard into a community-wide reckoning nobody had anticipated when Karen first walked across our grass with her clipboard and her laminated binder of invented rules.
Dồn nén trước cao trào xét tổ over Willow Creek, Laya Hellbrit.
The community election legally mandated by the state board now scheduled. The criminal case against Karen advancing steadily, and the neighborhood itself slowly, cautiously beginning to imagine what leadership without her constant shadow might actually feel like. Diane and I spent that stretch preparing methodically for what she called the final consolidation, organizing every document, every time-stamped photograph, every witness statement from Gary, Priya, Ruth, and the broader coalition into a single, comprehensive civil complaint addressing the fence destruction and years of baseless fines against our family specifically. This part isn't about proving she's wrong anymore, Diane explained over coffee one morning, spreading files across her office table. Everyone already knows that. This part is about making sure there are real, lasting consequences, not just a quiet resignation and a fresh start somewhere else. That warning felt important. Karen, despite everything, still owned her house, still lived 3 streets away, still occasionally appeared at community events with a brittle, defiant smile that suggested she hadn't yet fully accepted how thoroughly her carefully constructed authority had collapsed around her. Ruth reported that Karen had begun quietly listing her house for sale, working with a realtor from outside the county, apparently hoping to relocate before the criminal case reached any formal resolution, a strategy Diane immediately flagged to Officer Reyes given the pending charges still actively moving forward. Officer Reyes, unbothered, explained calmly that a formal criminal case didn't require Karen to remain in the county, only to remain reachable through her attorney, and available for scheduled court appearances, a legal reality that offered less dramatic satisfaction than I'd hoped for but real accountability nonetheless. Gary organized one final coalition meeting before the community election, ensuring every affected family understood their rights regarding the regulatory board's fine reimbursement recommendation, helping several elderly residents in particular navigate the paperwork required to formally request refunds for years of baseless HOA citations. I found myself, almost without noticing, becoming something like an informal advocate within that coalition, helping neighbors organize their own documentation. The way Diane had taught me, the strange, unexpected outcome of a fight that began purely as an attempt to protect my own family's small patch of grass. Priya, reflecting on the whole ordeal one evening on her porch, told me something I hadn't fully considered before, that Karen's downfall wasn't really caused by any single dramatic confrontation, but by the slow, patient accumulation of ordinary people simply refusing to stay quiet any longer, one document at a time. The community election drew unprecedented turnout for Willow Creek, nearly every household participating, an obvious response to years of quiet exhaustion finally finding an outlet. Gary, encouraged strongly by the coalition, agreed to run for HOA president himself, promising transparent governance and strict term limit adherence going forward. Karen did not attend the election meeting, sending instead a brief written statement wishing the community well in whatever direction it chooses. A notably muted final message from someone who'd once filled every newsletter with confident, controlling certainty about exactly how the neighborhood should function. Gary won overwhelmingly, and among his very first official acts, he authorized a full independent audit of Willow Creek's HOA finances covering Karen's entire tenure, formally requesting the state regulatory board's continued involvement to ensure the process remained transparent and free from any lingering influence. That audit, completed over several subsequent weeks, confirmed what Diane and Officer Reyes had already substantially uncovered: the missing $40,000 in reserve funds, the undisclosed conflict of interest with her son's firm, and additional smaller discrepancies suggesting years of quiet, incremental financial mismanagement beyond even the Greenway project itself. The audit findings were forwarded directly to the county prosecutor's office, expanding Karen's existing forgery charges to include formal allegations of financial misappropriation, a development Diane described as closing every remaining door for any possible defense strategy built around minimizing her actions as simple overzealousness. I read the expanded charges twice, sitting alone at our kitchen table, feeling less triumphant than simply, finally, exhausted in a settled, peaceful way rather than the anxious, defensive exhaustion that had defined nearly a year of our lives. Something enormous was finally, undeniably, coming to an end. Mark and I began, cautiously, allowing ourselves small moments of normalcy again. A quiet dinner on our newly rebuilt patio, Emma and Jake playing freely in a yard no longer haunted by flashlight beams or measuring tape. The simple, ordinary rhythms of family life we'd nearly forgotten we deserved. Karen's house sale finalized quietly that same month, the buyers reportedly unaware of any history attached to the property beyond its listing price. A strange, quiet erasure that Priya noted with a mixture of relief and lingering discomfort, wondering aloud whether Karen would simply repeat this pattern somewhere new. Diane assured us the criminal case and regulatory findings would follow Karen regardless of address, part of permanent public record accessible to any future community she might attempt to involve herself in. A small but meaningful safeguard against the exact concern Priya had raised. The civil complaint against Karen specifically for our fence destruction and the pattern of baseless fines moved toward formal mediation that week.
Diane recommending we pursue direct compensation and a permanent restraining order rather than a prolonged trial, prioritizing closure over an extended, exhausting courtroom battle.
Karen's attorney, during mediation, finally offered something resembling acknowledgement, agreeing to a settlement covering our fence replacement costs, the accumulated baseless fines, and legal fees, alongside a formal restraining order prohibiting any future contact or proximity to our property. A resolution Diane called about as clean as these things get. I sat across that mediation table from Karen for the first time in months, close enough to see how genuinely diminished she looked. The confident certainty entirely gone, replaced by something tired and small. I felt no satisfaction watching that, only a quiet confirmation that we'd simply told the truth, consistently, until it mattered. She didn't apologize, Not really, offering only a brief, clipped acknowledgement that mistakes were made in how the pathway situation was handled. Language so carefully hedged it barely qualified as accountability at all. Diane told me afterward not to expect more. People like Karen rarely offered genuine remorse. Only strategic retreat. The settlement finalized within days. The restraining order formally entered into county records. And for the first time in nearly a year, I felt the strange, unfamiliar sensation of a conflict actually completely ending, rather than simply pausing before its next inevitable escalation. Gary's new HOA leadership implemented sweeping transparency reforms that month. Published meeting minutes, mandatory financial disclosures, strict term limit enforcement, and an independent grievance process allowing homeowners to formally dispute fines without fear of the kind of retaliation our family had endured for months. Priya, reflecting on those reforms, said something that stuck with me long afterward, that the healthiest communities weren't the ones without conflict, but the ones with structures strong enough to resolve conflict fairly. Structures Willow Creek had apparently lacked entirely until Karen's overreach finally forced everyone to build them. Ruth organized a small, informal neighborhood gathering to celebrate Gary's reforms. An easy, relaxed afternoon entirely unlike the tense HOA meetings that had defined the previous year. Families mingling freely across the same cul-de-sac park that had once been the disputed heart of an entire manufactured pathway conspiracy. Emma and Jake played there that afternoon without hesitation, running freely across grass that had never actually belonged to anyone but the community's shared park land. The real, legitimate public space that had existed the entire time. Entirely separate from the private lawn Karen had spent a year trying to claim. I watched them from a bench near Priya, feeling something settle fully inside me for the first time in months. Not just relief, but a quiet, hard-won confidence that our family's home, our children's safety, and our own voice in this community had all survived something that could easily have destroyed them. Diane, closing out our file formally that week, told me our case had already become something of a quiet reference point within local HOA legal circles, cited informally among attorneys handling similar disputes as an example of how thorough, patient documentation could ultimately dismantle even deeply entrenched authority. That felt like an unexpected legacy for a conflict that began with orange survey stakes and a stolen garden gnome. Though Diane reminded me it made perfect sense, most HOA power, hers included, rested entirely on people believing challenging it was impossible. A belief we'd simply, methodically proven false. The Hendersons, hearing about our case's resolution through Priya's continued outreach, reached out themselves for the first time in years, considering whether to pursue their own long-dormant complaint regarding their old drainage easement dispute, encouraged that accountability, however delayed, remained genuinely possible. Gary invited me to formally join Willow Creek's new grievance review committee, a volunteer position ensuring future disputes received fair, transparent handling rather than the years of quiet, unchecked authority Karen had wielded. I accepted, understanding finally why Priya had stayed so patiently engaged throughout everything. As the criminal case against Karen moved toward its scheduled court date, our family settled into a rhythm of ordinary life we'd almost forgotten was possible. Quiet mornings, a secure fence, a community finally governed by rules rather than one woman's confident, unchecked certainty about what belonged to whom. Chao Treo's opening chapter,
Bùng nổ xung đột.
arrived on the scheduled morning of Karen's criminal court hearing. The county courthouse unexpectedly full of Willow Creek residents. Gary, Priya, Ruth, and nearly a dozen coalition families arriving together in a show of quiet, unified support for accountability finally reaching completion. Karen arrived separately, flanked by her attorney, visibly thinner than the confident woman who'd once walked our lawn in pristine white sneakers, her composure clearly costing her enormous effort as reporters from the local news outlet that had run the Greenway story waited near the entrance. The prosecutor presented the case methodically, the forged easement signature, the fraudulent grant application, the misappropriated reserve funds, the pattern of retaliatory fines and property destruction. Each piece of evidence Diane and Officer Reyes had spent months assembling now laid out formally before the court. Karen's attorney attempted to frame the forgery as an isolated lapse in judgment rather than a pattern. But Officer Reyes's testimony, methodically cataloging the Henderson family's remarkably similar experience years earlier, undermined that framing significantly, establishing clear, deliberate intent rather than a single, uncharacteristic mistake. I testified that afternoon, describing simply and factually everything that had happened, the fines, the surveillance, the destroyed fence, careful throughout to stick strictly to documented facts rather than emotion, exactly as Diane had coached me, letting the evidence itself carry whatever weight it needed to carry. Karen watched me testify without expression, though I noticed her hands gripping the table edge tightly enough that her knuckles whitened. The first genuinely unguarded moment I'd seen from her since this entire ordeal began. A small crack in composure that felt, oddly, more human than any prior confrontation. During cross-examination, her attorney pressed me about whether personal animosity had motivated our complaint, a predictable strategy Diane had prepared me for thoroughly. I answered honestly that I'd simply wanted to keep my own yard safe for my children, and that everything else had followed from Karen's own choices, not mine. The judge, reviewing the mounting documentary evidence, forged signatures, financial records, surveillance footage, the pattern across multiple families, set a follow-up sentencing date, indicating clearly through her measured but pointed questioning that she viewed the case as considerably more serious than Karen's attorney had initially framed it. Outside the courthouse afterward, reporters approached several of us for comment. I kept my statement brief, saying only that our community had learned, painfully but thoroughly, the importance of transparency and accountability in shared governance, careful not to editorialize further than the facts themselves already demonstrated. That evening's local news segment, running alongside the earlier Greenway story follow-up, framed the case accurately and soberly, focusing on the pattern of documented misconduct rather than sensationalizing it. The fair, measured treatment, Diane said, reflected well on the strength and clarity of our original documentation. Karen's son's landscape firm, already stripped of its municipal contracts, formally dissolved that same week, unable to sustain operations following the collapse of its primary anticipated revenue source and the reputational damage from the public forgery revelations now permanently attached to its brief, troubled history. Deb, still working at the HOA office under Gary's new transparent leadership, told me privately that morale across the entire administrative staff had visibly lifted, describing an atmosphere of genuine relief now that meetings followed actual bylaws rather than one person's shifting, unpredictable interpretations of them. Priya's coalition, meanwhile, formalized itself into an official neighborhood watchdog group under Gary's new grievance committee structure, ensuring future HOA leadership, whoever it might eventually be, remained permanently accountable to documented rules rather than personal authority. A lasting institutional safeguard against Karen's exact playbook ever succeeding again. I received a call from Diane the following week confirming the sentencing hearing date, explaining that given the scope of the forgery, fraud, and documented pattern of retaliatory harassment, the prosecutor intended to recommend a combination of financial restitution, probation, and a formal prohibition against Karen holding any future HOA leadership position. That final provision felt significant beyond its legal weight, a formal, permanent acknowledgement that whatever authority Karen had once wielded so confidently over Willow Creek had been fundamentally, irreversibly forfeited, not through community rumor or informal exclusion, but through documented, legally binding consequence. Mark and I discussed it that evening on our rebuilt patio, watching Emma and Jake chase fireflies across a lawn finally, completely secure, both legally and emotionally, in a way it hadn't felt in over a year. We didn't just protect our yard, Mark said quietly.
We fixed something.
The following weeks moved with a strange, gentle normalcy after so much sustained tension. The sentencing hearing still pending but the neighborhood itself settling comfortably into Gary's transparent leadership. Disputes now resolved through the formal grievance process rather than fear, favoritism, or unchecked personal authority. Ruth, reflecting on everything one afternoon at the community garden Gary's board had newly established, said she hadn't felt this comfortable in Willow Creek since before Karen's presidency began, describing the neighborhood's earlier years with a fondness that made clear how much had genuinely been lost, and was now, finally, being restored. Officer Reyes reached out one final time before the sentencing hearing, confirming that 2 additional families from neighboring HOAs, having heard about our case through local news coverage, had come forward with their own remarkably similar complaints against Karen's son's firm, expanding the case's scope even further. That expansion, Diane explained, would likely factor into sentencing considerations, demonstrating a pattern extending well beyond Willow Creek alone. Evidence that this hadn't been an isolated conflict born from one neighborhood's unique dysfunction, but a deliberate, repeated strategy Karen and her son had refined across multiple communities. I felt, hearing that, a complicated mixture of vindication and quiet sadness, relief that the truth kept expanding and holding, but sorrow, too, at how many other families had likely endured similar fear and exhaustion before anyone finally possessed the resources and resolved to challenge it fully. Priya's coalition invited those newly identified families to a joint meeting, sharing documentation strategies and legal contacts, an informal support network growing organically from what had once been one woman's private, isolated fight over a disputed strip of lawn along her own property line. Gary, addressing the neighborhood at a community meeting that month, formally thanked the coalition by name, acknowledging publicly what many had privately understood for months, that Willow Creek's return to functional, fair governance had depended entirely on ordinary residents refusing to accept unchecked authority simply because challenging it felt exhausting or impossible. That acknowledgement meant more to me than I expected, not because I needed public credit, but because it marked something important shifting permanently in how the neighborhood understood itself, no longer a community defined by one dominant personality, but one capable of genuine, functional collective governance. As the sentencing hearing approached, Diane prepared a final victim impact statement with me, carefully documenting the emotional, financial, and practical toll the year-long ordeal had taken on our family, balancing honest vulnerability with the same measured factual precision that had carried our case successfully this far. Writing that statement forced me to fully confront, in a way I'd mostly avoided during the practical grind of gathering evidence, just how frightening and exhausting the entire experience had genuinely been. The sleepless nights, Emma's fear, Jake's confused questions, the constant low hum of anxiety beneath even ordinary days. Mark read the statement afterward, quiet for a long moment before saying simply that he was proud of how I turned fear into something methodical and effective rather than letting it consume us entirely. That reflection meant more to me than any legal victory the courtroom could eventually deliver. The morning of the sentencing hearing arrived clear and unremarkable. An ordinary summer day entirely unlike the emotional weight it carried for our family and the dozen other households whose stories had, ultimately, become intertwined with ours through Karen's own repeated, escalating choices. The courtroom filled again. Familiar faces from Willow Creek joined now by representatives from the two additional affected communities. Quiet, unified presence that Diane said likely carried real weight with the sentencing judge, demonstrating the true scope of harm beyond any single isolated complaint. Karen's attorney made a final plea for leniency, citing her volunteer community service history and lack of prior criminal record. Careful phrasing that noticeably avoided any mention of the years of documented harassment, financial mismanagement, and repeated forgery the court had already thoroughly reviewed and accepted as established fact. I read my victim impact statement aloud when called, my voice steady despite the nerves, describing honestly how a simple, decades-old neighborhood shortcut had been weaponized into nearly a year of fear, financial strain, and disruption for my family, ending with a simple request for accountability, not vengeance. The judge, delivering her ruling, addressed Karen directly, describing the case as demonstrating a troubling, sustained pattern of abusing entrusted community authority for personal and financial gain, language that felt, hearing it spoken aloud in that quiet courtroom, like the truth finally receiving its proper, undeniable weight. Karen was sentenced to 18 months probation, ordered to pay full restitution covering our fence, the accumulated baseless fines across multiple families, and legal costs, alongside a permanent, legally binding prohibition against ever again serving in any homeowners association leadership or financial oversight capacity. That final provision landed with the heaviest weight of all, not merely a temporary consequence, but a permanent structural safeguard ensuring Karen could never again quietly accumulate the kind of unchecked authority that had allowed her to terrorize an entire neighborhood for years before anyone found the resolve to stop her. Karen left the courtroom that day without looking at any of us, her attorney guiding her quickly toward a side exit while reporters gathered near the main entrance. I felt no urge to call after her, no need for a final confrontation. The court's ruling had already said everything that needed saying. Outside, Priya, Gary, Ruth, and the coalition families gathered quietly together, not celebrating exactly, but sharing something closer to relieved. exhausted solidarity, the particular, hard-earned peace that comes only after a long, patient fight finally, undeniably, completely ends in favor of the truth.
Lộ diện và trừng phạt con tin unfolding in the week follow sentencing.
As the state HOA regulatory board finalized its own separate administrative penalties against Karen, formally barring her from any future community association role statewide, a parallel civil safeguard reinforcing the criminal court's permanent leadership prohibition. The regulatory board also ordered Willow Creek's HOA to complete its promised fine reimbursement process, ultimately refunding over $31,000 in baseless citations, issued during Karen's improperly extended, legally void presidency, a figure that stunned even longtime residents once the full accounting became public. Gary's board processed those reimbursements transparently, publishing the full accounting in the neighborhood newsletter, a level of financial openness that would have been unthinkable under Karen's leadership, demonstrating concretely how differently a community could function once accountability replaced unchecked personal authority. Karen's son, separately, faced his own consequences beyond the dissolved firm, the county's economic crimes unit pursuing additional charges related to the fraudulent grant application he'd knowingly submitted alongside his mother, expanding the family's legal troubles well beyond Karen's individual sentencing outcome. I learned through Officer Reyes, in one of our final conversations regarding the case, that the two additional communities affected by similar schemes had also successfully pursued their own restitution, the combined financial penalties across all three neighborhoods reaching well over six figures by the time everything concluded. That broader scope, once fully revealed, transformed how local news covered the story's conclusion, framing it less as one neighborhood's isolated HOA dispute and more as a cautionary case study in unchecked community governance, cited afterward in at least two statewide discussions about strengthening HOA oversight legislation. Diane mentioned, almost as an aside during our final meeting, that a state legislator's office had reached out requesting details about our case to inform a proposed bill, strengthening mandatory HOA term limits and financial transparency requirements. A strange, unexpected ripple effect from what had started as a dispute over a garden gnome. I felt genuinely moved learning that, understanding finally the fuller shape of what our patient, methodical documentation had ultimately accomplished, not just protecting our own family's yard, but contributing, however modestly, toward safeguards that might prevent other families from enduring anything similar in communities we'd never even visit. Karen's house, sold months earlier, sat under new ownership now. A young family Priya mentioned seeing move in with visible relief, unaware entirely of the history, embedded in that particular stretch of Willow Creek streets. Quiet, ordinary continuation life always eventually finds after even the most difficult chapters close. Gary's transparent leadership continued strengthening the neighborhood's culture month by month. Disputes now resolved through documented process rather than fear. The community garden thriving. The annual summer picnic returning after a 2-year absence nobody had quite realized was connected to the tension Karen's presidency had quietly created. Emma and Jake, watching their parents through the entire ordeal without fully understanding its complexity, seemed to absorb something simpler and more important instead, that fairness sometimes required patience and persistence, that standing up for what belonged to you rightfully wasn't selfish, but necessary, especially when done honestly and carefully. Mark and I spoke often, In the quiet months following sentencing, about how close we'd come to simply giving up somewhere in the middle of that exhausting year, paying whatever fines Karen demanded just to make the pressure stop. The way so many families before us apparently had. What ultimately kept us going, we agreed, wasn't anger alone, but the growing understanding that giving up would mean not just losing our own fight, but implicitly enabling whatever came next for the Hendersons, for Gary, for every family Karen would inevitably have continued targeting had nobody ever stopped her. Priya's informal coalition, now formally recognized under Gary's grievance committee structure, continued meeting periodically even after our case fully closed, evolving into something like a permanent community safeguard, ensuring Willow Creek's hard-won transparency never quietly eroded back into the unchecked authority it had only recently escaped. I stayed involved with that committee myself, finding unexpected purpose in helping newer neighbors understand their rights. A strange, meaningful continuation of a fight that had begun purely defensively but had gradually transformed into something genuinely constructive for the entire community we called home. Deb, reflecting once during a quiet office visit months later, told me she still sometimes found herself instinctively hesitating before sharing information freely, old habits from years under Karen's controlling presidency taking real time to fully unlearn. A reminder that recovery from that kind of environment extended well beyond formal legal resolution. Ruth's community garden, expanded under Gary's new leadership, became something of an informal gathering space where the coalition families continued building genuine friendships that had originated, strangely enough, from shared grievances against Karen. Relationships now sustained instead by something considerably warmer and more lasting. The Hendersons, encouraged by our case's outcome, successfully pursued their own long-delayed compensation for the drainage easement dispute years earlier, finally receiving both financial restitution and a formal apology from their current HOA board. Closure they'd assumed, for years, would simply never arrive. I thought often, during that stretch, about Diane's early observation that Karen's entire strategy had depended on exhaustion, on the reasonable assumption that most people would eventually simply comply rather than sustain a prolonged fight. Our case's outcome, and its ripple effects, felt like proof that assumption could be wrong. Officer Reyes, in our final formal conversation, thanked me somewhat unexpectedly, saying cases built on thorough, patient documentation like ours made genuine accountability possible in situations that too often quietly slipped through cracks simply because victims lacked either the resources or the sustained resolve to fully pursue them. That comment stayed with me, understanding finally that our year of fear, fines, and quiet documentation had ultimately produced something considerably larger than a favorable ruling for our own family, a template, imperfect but real, for how ordinary people could successfully challenge entrenched, unchecked authority through patience and evidence rather than confrontation alone. Gary's HOA board, at its year-end meeting, formally renamed the small cul-de-sac park at the neighborhood's center Unity Green, a modest but meaningful gesture acknowledging the community's difficult journey back toward genuine collective governance. A name chosen through open resident vote rather than any single leader's personal decree. Watching Emma and Jake play there that afternoon, surrounded by neighbors who'd once avoided our family entirely out of fear or confusion, now laughing together, freely across grass belonging fully and legitimately to the whole community, felt like the truest, most complete resolution this long ordeal could have ever offered. Karen, as far as any of us knew afterward, moved to a different state entirely. Her permanent statewide HOA leadership ban and criminal record following regardless of address. Quiet, lasting consequence ensuring whatever community she settled into next would never unknowingly inherit the pattern Willow Creek had fought so hard to end. How Kwa settled gently over the following months. Our family's life returning gradually to an ordinary rhythm we'd once feared we might never fully recover. Quiet mornings, the secure, legally unambiguous fence, and a neighborhood finally governed by transparent, accountable structures rather than any single person's unchecked will. Mark and I hosted a small gathering that autumn, inviting Priya, Gary, Ruth, and several coalition families to celebrate not victory exactly, but simple, hard-earned normalcy. Our rebuilt patio filled with laughter that felt entirely different from the tense, anxious conversations that had once dominated our home for nearly a year. Emma, now approaching 9, mentioned once that she barely remembered being afraid of the HOA lady, her childhood resilience already smoothing over the sharpest edges of that difficult year. Though I suspected some quieter lessons about fairness and persistence had settled more permanently within her than she yet realized. Jake, still young enough to find the whole ordeal somewhat abstract, mostly remembered the new fence, proudly showing visiting friends the gate daddy, and mommy fixed forever, a simple, hopeful framing that captured, in its own small way, exactly what our family had ultimately fought so hard to secure. Willow Creek itself continued evolving under Gary's steady, transparent leadership, its community garden thriving, its meeting minutes fully public, its term limits strictly enforced, a neighborhood that had, through considerable difficulty, rebuilt itself into something genuinely closer to the fair, cooperative community it had always claimed to be. I kept Diane's business card pinned to our refrigerator long after the case fully closed, less out of anticipated future need than as a quiet reminder of everything patience, documentation, and refusing to be quietly worn down had ultimately made possible for our family and, unexpectedly, for so many others. Looking back now, I understand the shortcut across our lawn was never really the point at all. It was simply the first visible thread of something much larger, unchecked authority, quiet fraud, and a community too exhausted to question it. That patience, evidence, and one properly surveyed fence finally, completely unraveled. Our lawn, secure now behind its permanent legal boundary, remains simply ours, exactly as the original deed always said it was, long before any clipboard, any laminated binder, or any confident stranger ever tried convincing us and an entire neighborhood. Otherwise, if there's one thing this ordeal taught our family, it's that quiet, careful truth, sustained patiently long enough, eventually outlasts even the loudest, most confident overreach, and that sometimes the strongest defense against someone determined to take everything isn't anger, but a single, well-documented, legally unbreakable line drawn firmly in the grass. Willow Creek moved forward that year not as the neighborhood Karen had tried to build in her own image, but as the fair, transparent community it had always been capable of becoming, proof that even the smallest patch of ordinary suburban grass can become the ground where real, lasting justice finally takes root.